I never thought that working as an archivist for the government would lead me to uncover something so horrifying. My job was supposed to be simple, mundane, sorting through decades of classified documents, declassifying what was deemed safe, and organizing the rest into their appropriate places. But one night, while digging through an old, forgotten filing cabinet deep in the basement of a government building, I found something that should have stayed hidden forever. It was late, the kind of late where the hum of the fluorescent lights above begins to sound like a distant, eerie whisper. The rest of my team had left hours ago, and I was the only one still there, determined to finish sorting through the last of the day's assignments. I had developed a habit of staying late. It was quieter, less distracting. But that night, I wish I had just gone home. The filing cabinet was old, rusted, and covered in dust. It stood out from the others, pushed into a corner as if forgotten. I hesitated for a moment before pulling open the drawer. Inside, there were only a few manila folders, yellowed with age. At first glance, they looked like they hadn't been touched in years. I sifted through them, expecting nothing more than outdated reports or routine security memos. But then I found it. A folder labeled simply Project Blackwater. Something about the name sent a chill down my spine. I'd heard whispers of Blackwater before, muttered by the older archivists, always in hushed tones as if afraid someone might overhear. It was a project so classified that not even the highest-ranking officials seemed to know what it was. No one was supposed to talk about it. No one was supposed to acknowledge it. I should have left it there, should have closed the drawer and gone home. But I didn't. My curiosity got the better of me. I pulled the folder out, my hands trembling slightly as I laid it on the desk. The first page was stamped with Top Secret in bold red letters, followed by the year 1964. I opened it. What I found inside defied explanation. There were transcripts of interviews, faded photographs, and a series of hand-drawn diagrams that looked more like something out of a science fiction novel than a government document. The photos were grainy, black and white, showing a nondescript military facility in the middle of a forest. But it was the subject of the interviews that made my blood run cold. The first transcript was dated July 5th, 1964. The interviewee was a former military officer, Colonel Jacob Winters. The words on the page were shaky, disjointed, as though the man had been speaking in a state of delirium. He kept mentioning a place called The Rift and something he referred to only as the incident. I leaned in closer, my heart pounding as I read his words. They were all wrong, the transcript began. We were never supposed to open it. We thought it was a doorway, but it wasn't. It was a warning, a gateway to something else, something dark. They came through those things. We couldn't stop them. We couldn't even understand what they were. The more I read, the more confused I became. Colonel Winters rambled on about experiments, about trying to harness something they had found buried deep beneath the facility. There was talk of non-human entities, of entire squads going missing, and strange lights in the sky. But then the transcript abruptly ended. There was no explanation, no follow-up report. The next document in the folder was a photograph, one that sent a jolt of pure terror through my body. It showed a group of soldiers standing in front of what looked like a massive, black, swirling void, their faces blank, as if they had been stripped of all emotion. Behind them, the void pulsed. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. It wasn't just darkness. It was something else, something alive. I stared at the photograph, feeling a growing sense of dread. What had they found? What had they unleashed? I flipped through the next few pages searching for answers, but the more I read, the worse it got. There were reports of strange occurrences near the facility, people going missing, wildlife behaving erratically, and strange electromagnetic disturbances. There were mentions of creatures seen in the woods, figures that didn't belong to this world. I glanced over my shoulder, suddenly feeling like I wasn't alone in the room. The air seemed heavier, thicker, as if something unseen was watching me, but I shook it off, telling myself it was just nerves, just a story. I kept reading. As I reached the final pages, I found another interview, this one dated December 1965, nearly a year after the first. The subject was a scientist, Dr. Helen Morrow, one of the lead researchers on Project Blackwater. Her words were frantic, desperate. "It's spreading," she had written. "We can't contain it. It's not just the rift, it's everything. It's in the air, in the ground, in the people. The void is alive and it's feeding. We were fools to think we could control it." The document ended with a single sentence that made my heart skip a beat. "They've shut it down, but it's not gone. It's still out there, waiting." I slammed the folder shut, my hands shaking uncontrollably. What the hell had I just read? What was Project Blackwater? And more importantly, what had they discovered that was so dangerous they had to erase all records of it? I leaned back in my chair, trying to steady my breathing. But the sense of unease wouldn't leave me. Something about the whole thing felt wrong, like I had stumbled onto something I was never meant to see. I should have reported it right then and there, should have taken the folder and handed it over to my superiors. But I didn't. I was too scared, too paranoid about what might happen if I did. The government had buried this for a reason, and now that I knew about it, I wasn't sure I wanted to be the one to dig it back up. But the damage was done. I had seen it. I knew. And somehow, deep down, I knew that I wasn't safe anymore. That night, I left the office in a daze. My mind was racing, filled with images of swirling voids and strange creatures lurking just beyond the edge of reality. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that the darkness I had uncovered was now watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. As I drove home, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, someone, sitting in the back seat. But there was nothing. Just the empty, dark road behind me. For now. But I couldn't escape the truth. The government had found something out there, something that was never meant to be found. And now, that secret was out. And it wasn't going to stay buried for long. For the next few days, I couldn't get the contents of the folder out of my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the photograph of that swirling void, those soldiers standing frozen in front of it, like hollowed-out shells of men. The words of Colonel Winters echoed in my mind. We were never supposed to open it. But they had opened it, whatever it was. And now, something was loose. I tried to go about my routine as if nothing had changed, but it had. The world felt different now, like I was living in the aftermath of a terrible disaster, even though no one else seemed to know about it. I became hyper-aware of everything around me. The hum of fluorescent lights seemed too loud, the shadows in the office stretched longer than they should have, and every creak of the building made my heart race. I kept the folder hidden in a locked drawer at my desk. I told myself I would take it to my superiors eventually, but deep down, I knew I wouldn't. The fear of what might happen, what they might do to me, kept my mouth shut. I had seen what the government was capable of, how easily they could erase someone's life. All it would take was a few phone calls, and I would disappear, just like the soldiers from Project Blackwater. And then the strange things began to happen. It started small, almost imperceptible. A misplaced document here, a flickering light there. Things that could easily be brushed off as coincidence. But I knew better. I felt it. Something was watching me. Something was waiting. The first real sign came when I was working late again, a habit I had tried to break since finding the file but hadn't quite managed. I was sitting at my desk, staring blankly at a report, my mind far from the mundane work in front of me. The office was silent, the kind of silence that feels too heavy, too thick, like the air itself is holding its breath. Then the lights flickered once, twice, and went out. I froze, my pulse quickening as darkness swallowed the room. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, that primal sense of dread creeping up my spine. For a moment, everything was utterly still. The silence was suffocating. Suddenly there was a noise, faint but distinct. It was coming from somewhere behind me, a soft scraping sound like something dragging across the floor. My breath hitched, and I slowly turned my head, straining to see in the darkness. The faint glow of the emergency exit light cast long, eerie shadows across the room, but there was no one there. Nothing that could have made that sound. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the darkness was playing tricks on me. But then it came again. Closer this time, unmistakable. It sounded like something was moving, just out of sight, skirting the edge of the light. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor as I did. My first instinct was to leave, to get out of that room as fast as I could, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I grabbed my phone from the desk, using its screen to cast a faint, dim light in front of me. My hand was shaking. The sound stopped. For a long moment I stood there scanning the room with the pitiful light from my phone. My eyes darted from corner to corner expecting to see something, someone, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence and the ever-growing sense that I wasn't alone. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Something moved just at the edge of the emergency light, a shadow that wasn't mine. It slid across the floor, fluid and unnatural, almost as if it were alive. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but it was gone before I could focus on it. The lights flickered back on. I stood there, rooted in place, my heart pounding in my chest. The room looked exactly the same as it had before, sterile and mundane, but I knew something had been there. I had felt it. Whatever it was gone now, but the air still felt thick, like I was breathing in something that didn't belong. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my things and bolted out of the office, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallways as I made my way to the elevator. The ride down felt agonizingly slow, each floor ticking by like a countdown to something terrible. When the doors finally slid open, I practically ran to my car. The drive home was a blur. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one darker than the last. Was it real? Had I imagined it? I wasn't sure anymore, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me even as I pulled into my driveway and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every rustle of the wind outside my window made me jump. I kept expecting to see that shadow again, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. But it never came. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that whatever was happening, it wasn't over. I couldn't go back to work, not yet. not after what I had seen. So I called in sick and spent the day trying to piece together what I had uncovered. I pulled out the folder from my desk and spread its contents across the dining table, poring over every detail again and again. The transcripts, the photographs, the reports, it all pointed to one thing. Whatever Project Blackwater had found, whatever they had opened, it wasn't just a simple experiment. It was something far more dangerous, something they couldn't control. And now, it had been set free. I stared at the photograph of the void, that swirling blackness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow connected to what I had experienced in the office. The way the shadows had moved, the feeling of being watched. It all felt too familiar, too real. But the worst part was the growing realization that there was no going back. I had opened the door to something I couldn't close, and now it was following me. The government had buried Project Blackwater for a reason, and I had dug it back up, and now I was going to pay the price. The morning after the incident at my office, I made a decision. I couldn't let this thing, whatever it was, control my life. I needed answers, and the only place I could think to find them was in the folder. Somewhere in those documents, there had to be a clue about what I had unleashed, or at least how to stop it. The air felt thick as I sat at the dining table staring at the disarray of papers scattered in front of me. I kept the blinds drawn, even though it was early afternoon, casting the room in a dim light that felt safer, less exposed. I had spent hours the day before reading the documents, but there were still pages I hadn't looked through, pages that I had been too afraid to touch. I steeled myself, then picked up a report that I had glossed over before. It was titled, Phase 2, Prolonged Exposure and Contact. As I read the first few lines, my heart sank. The report detailed what happened to those who spent too much time near the anomaly. It wasn't just the soldiers who were affected. It was anyone who had been within a certain radius of the void for too long. Symptoms began with paranoia and vivid hallucinations. People reported feeling as if something was constantly watching them, following them, even when they were alone. The worst cases described an entity, a dark figure that would appear at the edge of their vision, just outside the reach of the light. Those who survived the exposure called it the Watcher. My blood ran cold. It was exactly what I had experienced at the office. That shadow, the feeling of being watched. It wasn't my imagination. It was the Watcher. The report went on to explain that the Watcher wasn't a figment of the mind. It was real, an entity that had been freed when Project Blackwater opened the anomaly. It had no form of its own, no physical body, but it could inhabit the darkness, slipping between shadows like a predator stalking its prey. Once it latched onto someone, it would never let go. It would haunt them, follow them, drive them mad, and eventually destroy them. I dropped the report, my hand shaking. The Watcher was real, and now it was hunting me. I stood up too quickly, knocking over my chair in the process. My pulse was racing and my breathing became shallow. I felt trapped, suffocated by the very air in the room. I had to get out. I needed to clear my head, get away from the suffocating weight of the documents. I threw on my coat and left the house, practically sprinting to my car. The cold air hit me like a wall as I stepped outside, but I didn't care. I just needed to drive. Anywhere but here. As I sped down the empty highway, the familiar sense of paranoia crept back in. Every car that passed me felt like it was following me. Every shadow on the road seemed to stretch toward me as if it were alive. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, anything that would confirm my worst fears. But there was nothing, just the endless stretch of road behind me. I don't know how long I drove, but eventually I found myself pulling into a parking lot at the edge of a state park. It was quiet, isolated, the kind of place where people came to escape the noise of the city. I sat in the car for a moment, letting the stillness calm my racing thoughts. I didn't know what to do, but sitting in the car wasn't helping, so I stepped out and started walking. The park was deserted, which was exactly what I needed. The trail wound through the trees, leading me deeper into the forest, away from everything. For a while, the sound of the wind rustling the leaves and the crunch of gravel underfoot was enough to quiet my mind. But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, that familiar sense of dread returned. I stopped in my tracks, my body tense. Something wasn't right. The wind had stopped. The birds had gone silent. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves behind me, like something moving through the brush. Slowly, I turned, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. At first, there was nothing, just the shadows cast by the fading light. But then, I saw it. A dark figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall, unnaturally so, its body cloaked in shadow. Its face, or what should have been its face, was featureless, an empty void where eyes and a mouth should have been. It didn't move, didn't breathe. It just watched. I froze, my mind racing. It couldn't be real. It had to be another hallucination, just like the ones described in the report. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized that it was real. I could feel its presence, feel the weight of its gaze on me. The watcher had found me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped by the thing's gaze. It didn't make a sound, didn't come closer, but I knew what it wanted. It was toying with me, feeding off my fear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I managed to break free of its gaze. I turned and bolted down the trail, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that thing. Branches whipped at my face as I ran, but I didn't slow down. I could hear it now, following me through the trees. It wasn't running, just moving, slipping through the shadows, always one step behind me. I reached my car and threw myself inside, slamming the door shut. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me several tries to get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life and I tore out of the parking lot without looking back. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw the figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching me drive away. But when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't stop driving until I was back at my house, the familiar walls of my home offering a small, temporary comfort. But even as I sat there trying to catch my breath, I knew the truth. The watcher wasn't done with me. It had found me once, and it would find me again. There was no escaping it, no running from it. It was only a matter of time. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, the watcher, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to slip into unconsciousness. Even when I finally dozed off, the nightmares were relentless. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, certain that the figure was standing at the foot of my bed, watching me with its empty, hollow face. Morning didn't bring any relief. I went through the motions, making coffee, showering, trying to pretend everything was normal, but it felt like I was trapped in a bad dream. Every shadow seemed deeper, every dark corner more menacing. The watcher was always there, lurking just outside my vision, waiting for the right moment to strike. I couldn't keep living like this. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. There had to be something in the documents, something I missed that could help me get rid of this thing. It wasn't just about me anymore. This thing was too dangerous. If it was tied to those experiments, then it could be haunting anyone involved. The thought that others might be going through the same terror made my skin crawl. I wasn't sure I'd survive much longer if I didn't find a way to end this. With that grim determination, I gathered the scattered papers on my dining room table once again. I'd gone through most of the documents in a daze, but there were still files left, some reports I'd avoided. I didn't know what I expected to find, but I had to keep searching. I sat down and began poring over the remaining files, searching for anything that might provide answers. After hours of fruitless reading, something caught my eye, an internal memo labeled Phase 3 Termination Protocol. I didn't remember seeing this memo before. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the paper. It was brief, written in cold, clinical language. The subject line alone sent a shiver down my spine. Containment of manifested entities, post-mortem procedures. The memo outlined the final phase of the experiment, what to do once the anomalies had fully manifested. According to the report, it wasn't just soldiers or scientists who had gone mad from exposure. People began vanishing, inexplicably. Some believed they had been taken by the entities they had released, by the Watchers, as they were now referred to in the later reports. Those who vanished were presumed dead, but there was no confirmation, no bodies, no remains. The memo noted that once a person was fully claimed by a Watcher, it was impossible to retrieve them. They simply ceased to exist, as if they had been erased from reality. Termination is the only option for individuals displaying signs of prolonged exposure, the memo stated bluntly. Further manifestation of entities will lead to containment failure. Immediate neutralization is advised. Neutralization. They were talking about killing people who had been marked by the Watchers. The more I read, the more horrific it became. They had developed a protocol to quietly remove those who were affected, ensuring that no one would discover the full extent of the catastrophe. The Watchers were out of control, and instead of trying to stop them, the government had opted to cover up the evidence, silencing anyone who knew too much. I leaned back in my chair, feeling like I had been punched in the gut. They knew about the Watchers all along. They had let this thing fester, growing out of control, and now it was hunting me. And the worst part? There was no solution. The memo made it clear that once a Watcher marked you, there was no escape. The only thing left was death. I dropped the memo, my mind racing. There had to be something more. Some way to stop this before it was too late. Then I remembered. There was one file I hadn't touched yet. It was the final folder in the box, labeled Restricted Eyes Only. I had avoided it, not wanting to open the last piece of the puzzle, fearing what it might reveal. But now, I had no choice. I reached for the folder and carefully opened it, revealing several pages covered in redacted text. Large black bars obscured most of the information, but there were a few sections that were still readable. The first page was a transcript of an interview with one of the surviving scientists from the project. The words were chilling. We didn't mean to open it. We didn't know what we were dealing with. At first, it was just a void, a darkness. But then it started to move. It was watching us. We could feel it. We thought we could contain it, but we were wrong. You can't contain something that's everywhere. The transcript continued, describing the first time the scientists encountered a Watcher. They had been experimenting with high energy fields, trying to manipulate the void they had discovered. That's when the entity appeared. It didn't have a form, not at first. It was just a shadow, an absence of light. But as the experiments progressed, it became more tangible. It started to take shape, feeding off the fear and madness of those who were exposed to it. The scientists tried to shut down the project, but it was too late. The watchers were already free. One line at the bottom of the transcript sent a fresh wave of dread through me. The more you fear it, the stronger it becomes. It thrives on terror. I stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. Was that the key? The watcher fed on fear, my fear. Every time I saw it, every time I panicked, I was giving it more power. But how could I not fear it? How could I possibly stand in front of something so horrifying and not be afraid? I set the folder down, feeling the weight of the knowledge I had just uncovered. This was what they had been trying to hide all along. Not just the existence of the Watchers, but the fact that they were created, or at least unleashed, by human hands. And now they were loose, feeding on fear, growing stronger with every victim they claimed. But now I had one small piece of information that might save me. If I could control my fear, I could weaken it, maybe even banish it. It was a long shot, but it was the only hope I had left, the only problem. The Watcher was still out there, and it was only a matter of time before it came for me again. The revelation that the Watchers fed on fear gnawed at me relentlessly. Every time I thought about the entity, every time its twisted, hollow form crept into my thoughts, I felt it grow stronger. I could sense its presence lingering just beyond my sight, like a predator biding its time, waiting for the moment when I was too weak to resist. But now I had a sliver of hope. If I could control my fear, I might be able to survive. But how do you stop being afraid of something that has its claws deep in your mind, something that stalks you with every flicker of shadow? I didn't have the answer to that, but I knew I had to try. The documents had made one thing clear. The more you feared, the more you gave it power. But there was something else too, a hint buried in the redacted transcript. The Watcher wasn't just feeding on random terror, it was deliberate, focused, and it wasn't bound by time or space in the way we understood. The scientists had unwittingly torn open a door, and now this thing could move freely. But it needed an anchor, a conduit. I was terrified to admit it, but I knew deep down, I was that anchor. Whatever they had unleashed, whatever was now attached to me, it wasn't going to let go easily. That night, as I sat in my living room surrounded by the scattered files and remnants of a life that seemed to be slipping away, I made a decision. I had to confront it. Running or hiding wouldn't work. I had to face the Watcher to look into that void and prove I wasn't afraid. Easier said than done, of course. I spent the rest of the evening preparing myself mentally. Every time I felt that familiar jolt of terror, the creeping sense that I wasn't alone, that something unspeakable was watching me, I forced myself to breathe slowly to calm the storm inside. My mind raced with the events of the past few days, but I kept telling myself I had control. I had to believe it. As midnight approached, the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. The Watcher was close. I could feel it just outside the edge of my vision, waiting for the right moment to step forward. I sat on the couch, gripping the armrest with white-knuckled hands, forcing myself to stay calm. I was done running. I was done being afraid. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, my breath misting in the cold air. It was coming. The lights flickered and then, with a faint crackle, went out entirely. I sat in complete darkness, my heart pounding in my chest, but I didn't move. I didn't let fear take over. "Show yourself," I whispered into the void, my voice barely more than a rasp. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, the shadows began to shift. From the far corner of the room, a shape started to materialize, darker than the darkness around it. The Watcher. Its form was just as I had seen in my nightmares, a twisted, elongated figure with limbs too long. A face that wasn't a face at all, just an empty, featureless void. It stood there motionless, staring at me. Or at least I felt like it was staring. I forced myself to keep breathing. My body wanted to scream, to run, to curl up in terror, but I resisted. I had to. This was the moment. It stepped closer, the shadows rippling around it like smoke. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to run, to get away from this thing. But I stayed rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the void where its face should be. It was inches away now, towering over me, its presence suffocating. I stared into the emptiness of its face, trying to push back the fear rising in my chest. It was hard, almost impossible. But I focused on one thought: it feeds on fear. If I can stay calm, it can't touch me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my heart thudding so loudly I was sure it could hear it. The Watcher's form seemed to shift, its limbs bending at unnatural angles, as if it was trying to provoke a reaction. I could feel it probing my mind, searching for a crack, for any hint of fear it could latch onto. "I'm not afraid," I said, my voice trembling but steady enough. "You don't control me." The Watcher didn't move. It just stood there, hovering over me, its presence pressing down like a weight on my chest. But I held my ground, refusing to give it what it wanted. I repeated the words in my head over and over like a mantra. "I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid." Minutes passed, though it felt like an eternity. The Watcher didn't attack, didn't reach out with its dark tendrils. It just watched, waiting for me to break. But I didn't. I couldn't. "I'm not afraid," I said again, louder this time with more conviction. And then, something happened. The Watcher's form began to flicker, its outline wavering as if it were struggling to maintain its shape. The oppressive weight in the room began to lift just slightly, and the cold receded. I was doing it. I was weakening it. The Watcher let out a low, guttural sound, something between a growl and a hiss. It stepped back, its limbs twitching erratically, as if it was being forced away. I stood up, my legs shaking but holding firm. "You can't hurt me," I said, my voice stronger now. "You have no power over me." The Watcher writhed, its form becoming more unstable with each passing second. The shadows around it grew thinner, more translucent. I could feel it losing its grip, its connection to me weakening. With one final, distorted shriek, the Watcher's form collapsed in on itself, dissolving into the darkness. And then, just like that, it was gone. The room was still, the oppressive air lifted. I stood there breathing heavily, my heart still racing, but I knew it was over. I had faced it, and I had won. The Watcher had been real, but so was my strength. I didn't know if it would come back, or if there were others still out there. But for now, I was free. The silence after the Watcher's disappearance was suffocating in its own way. I stood there alone in the darkness, trembling from head to toe, but this time not from fear, more from the weight of what I had just endured. The room felt too quiet, too still, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. The shadows stayed where they were, the cold didn't return, and the oppressive presence that had clung to me for days was gone. I was free, or at least I thought I was. I slowly sank into the couch, trying to process what had just happened. My mind raced, replaying every moment, every step of my journey into the dark truth behind those secret documents. The Watcher, this creature that had latched onto me, feeding on my fear, wasn't just some figment of imagination. It was real, and it had been connected to something far bigger, something the government had been hiding for years. The files were still scattered around me, a grim reminder of the events that had led me to this point. I reached out and picked up the stack of papers, my fingers brushing over the faded ink and stamped top secret markings. How many more Watchers were out there? How many people had been consumed by their fear, helpless against these predatory entities that fed off terror like a drug? As I stared at the pages, a chilling thought crept into my mind. The documents had mentioned others who had encountered the Watchers and other creatures like them. People who had been silenced, disappeared, or worse. Was I truly free? Or had I just momentarily escaped the grip of something far more sinister? I stood up, my legs shaky but firm, and began gathering the documents into a pile. The temptation to burn them, to destroy every trace of what I had uncovered, was overwhelming. But I couldn't. This truth was too big, too dangerous to hide away forever. People needed to know what was out there, what had been lurking in the shadows, hidden behind the veneer of government secrecy. But revealing the truth wasn't going to be easy. I thought about the lengths the government had gone to, the lives they had destroyed to keep this hidden. And I knew, without a doubt, that they would come for me if I ever tried to expose it. I wasn't safe, not really. The Watcher might be gone, but the real threat, the people who knew about these creatures, who studied them, used them, were still out there. And they wouldn't let me walk away unscathed. I needed to be smart, careful. Over the next few days, I worked tirelessly, compiling everything I had learned. I wrote down every detail, every strange occurrence, every moment of fear that had clawed at me since I first stumbled upon those files. But I also wrote down what had happened when I faced the Watcher, how I had weakened it by refusing to give in to my terror. Knowledge was power. I couldn't stop what was out there, but I could at least give others the tools to fight back, to resist. I uploaded my findings to a secure server, encrypting the files and scattering the data across multiple locations. I made sure that if something happened to me, the truth wouldn't die with me. There were people who needed to see this, who could do something about it. Journalists, whistleblowers, people with the courage to stand up against the machine. Once the files were uploaded, I sat back and took a deep breath. The weight on my chest had lessened, but it was still there, a constant reminder that I was living on borrowed time. The government wouldn't let me get away with this. The Watchers might not be done with me either. But for now, I had done what I could. The following weeks passed in a blur. I avoided my usual routines, moving from place to place, never staying in one location too long. I kept my phone turned off, my contact with the outside world minimal. Every knock on the door, every stranger passing me on the street, sent my heart racing. But I fought the urge to panic. Fear couldn't control me anymore. One evening, as I sat in a dingy motel room miles from home, I heard a soft knock at the door. My body tensed immediately, every muscle coiled in readiness. I hadn't told anyone where I was staying. No one should know I was here. Slowly, I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. No one stood outside. My heart pounded as I backed away from the door, trying to keep my mind calm. Maybe it was just a mistake, someone knocking on the wrong door. But deep down, I knew better. They had found me. I quickly gathered my things, stuffing what little I had into a small backpack, and slipped out through the back exit of the motel. The night was cold and dark, and the streets were empty. I moved through the shadows, avoiding the glow of the streetlights, keeping my head down as I made my way to the nearest bus station. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stop. Not yet. As I boarded the bus, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the shadows. But there was no one there. Just the empty street, silent and still. For now, I was safe. But the watchers were out there, and so were the ones who had created them. I settled into my seat, staring out the window as the bus rumbled to life and pulled away from the station. The documents were out there now. The truth was spreading. It was only a matter of time before the world knew what I had uncovered. But whether they would believe it, that was another story. The road ahead was long, uncertain, and filled with danger. But I was ready. I had faced the darkness, and I had survived. For now.